So greetings to all. Welcome to the first session of the Islamic History and Thought lecture series for the year 2022. So for the first time in this series, we're holding a lecture in hybrid mode with the public present here at the Aga Khan Centre in London, which makes this event quite special. So as usual, I would like to remind you that the previous lectures have been recorded and they're available on the IAS website and the IAS YouTube channel. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr Meryem Sebti, who is a researcher at the French National Research Centre and a visiting lecturer at the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris. A doctor in philosophy and doctor habilitatus, she is a specialist of Islamic philosophy and of Avicenna's thought in particular. She has published several academic articles and books. Among these, a book on the human soul in Avicenna's philosophy, Avicenna l'âme humaine, published in 2000, and numerous articles on Avicenna's doctrine of the soul and theory of knowledge. Her latest publication is a monograph entitled Avicenne, Prophétie et Gouvernement du Monde, Avicenna, Prophecy and Government of the World. So today's lecture is partly dedicated to the topic of this monograph, namely the role of the prophet in Avicenna's thoughts. The lecture will last for about 30 to 45 minutes and will be followed by a discussion with Dr. Toby Meyer, who kindly accepted to take part in this session, and myself. I will now give the floor to Dr. Meryem Sebti.
First of all, I would like to thank the Institute of Ismaili Studies for inviting me today. So my talk is entitled The Metaphysical Dimension of the Prophet in Avicenna's Thought. Until now, in Avicennian study, the figure of the prophet has been mainly studied through the doctrine called the three modes of prophecy. Thus, the prophet is presented as a human being whose intellect, imagination, and active power, that is to say, his soul's capacity to act on matter, are singularly developed. This well-known doctrine led Ibn Taymiyyah to strongly condemn Avicenna's prophetology. According to the Hanbali theologian, the consequence of Avicenna's doctrine is that any man who would perfect these three powers could reach the stage of prophethood. It is this highly condemnable doctrine which he believes led two philosophers, as-Sohrawardi and Ibn Sab'in, to seek to become prophets themselves. However, according to Avicenna, prophecy has a metaphysical dimension that the Hanbali theologian missed. Indeed, if prophecy is discussed at the very end of the Metaphysics of the Shifa in the 10th book, it is because the existence of the prophet is part of a complex metaphysical system of which it is one of the outcomes. Thus, Avicenna's doctrine of prophecy cannot be understood in isolation from the metaphysic doctrine of divine providence. The Persian philosopher clearly states that the prophet is a gift of divine providence to human beings. The prophet plays an indispensable mediating role between human beings and their creator. In Avicenna's metaphysical system, the movement of procession from the first principle and the movement of conversion beginning in the sublunary world and ending in the same principle are articulated around the mediating person of the prophet, who is thus endowed with a major metaphysical function. The mediating function of the prophet is clearly affirmed by Avicenna in his Risala al-Adhawiyya fi Amr al-Ma'ad, where he asserts that if God has granted all men his inspiration and light, the mediation, wisata, of the prophet would have been unnecessary. And you can read this in the handout. It's the first text, but sorry, I don't have the time to read the handout with you. This assertion is decisive concerning the prophetic function in Avicenna's thought. Indeed, in the metaphysical process, which originates in the pure unity of the first to reach the fragmented multiplicity of the sensible world, the function of mediating entities is decisive. Avicenna's cosmology would thus be inconceivable without the mediating function of the spiritual substances that are the separate intellects and the celestial souls, which Avicenna equates with the angel of the Quranic revelation. The celestial world is composed of intelligences, souls, and heavenly bodies. Its structure is hierarchical and accounts for the derivation of the multiple from the one. The function of the celestial entities in the dynamic of the processional movement is coupled with another equally indispensable function. The angel transmits divine knowledge to the ontological lower order. It is this knowledge received from the angel that enables human beings to turn to the divine word and aspire to the return, the Ma'ad, which alone confers on human life its full dignity. Let us recall that the goal of human life, according to Avicenna, is for the rational soul to become a separate spiritual substance in which the beauty of the intelligible world is reflected. That means to become similar to the higher angel of the celestial order. This process of perfection, which is the hallmark of human existence, could not take place without the mediation of the celestial entities. They are the mediating entities par excellence, without whom there would be no process of conversion. The prophet also performs an indispensable mediating function. Indeed, the survival of the human species required the existence among it of a prophet. Without this messenger of God, men would remain deprived of ethical laws, unable to found cities in which equity and justice reigned. And the human species would disappear because the violence that men would exercise toward each other would bring them about their end. The prophet, by bringing to the human being a law revealed by God, extends the effect of God's providence to the human society. He founds the very possibility of a social life. The prophet is radically different from other human beings in that he is the only one to receive the revealed law, the Sharia. This prerogative makes him alone fit to be the nomotet and the founder of the fair city. The mission of the prophet does not take place because a man has been able to fully realize the perfection of his noetic and psychic powers. It enters, like the other manifestation of the divine generosity, into a provident plan conceived from all eternity by God. In the chapter on prophecy, in the last book of the Metaphysical of the Shifa, Avicenna clearly states that the prophet is a gift of divine providence. This is text 2 of your handout. I cannot dwell now and here, maybe later with a question, on the moral and political implication of this passage. What we are concerned with here is the claim that the prophet, as an individual, is an effect of divine providence. This is also on your handout, text number 3. Avicenna specifies also that the advent of the prophet in the world is a scare event that occurs only rarely in history. We can maybe read this text together. It's text number 4. Moreover, this individual who is a prophet is not one whose likes occur in every period, for the matter receptive of a perfection like his occur only in few bodily composition. It follows necessarily then that the prophet, may God's prayers and peace be upon him, must plan with great care to ensure the preservation of what he prescribes and legislates in matter pertaining to human welfare. By elaborating a doctrine of secondary causality, Avicenna can account for the fact that the existence of the prophet as an individual is aimed by divine providence. This providence, which he says, endows human beings with eyelashes and a stooped foot to facilitate their existence, could not fail to assure among them the existence of a human being who acts as a mediator between the heavenly world and the sensible world. Thus, the existence of the prophet is necessary. It is necessary from a political and ethical point of view, and also, as we will see, from a noetic and epistemologic perspective. The consequence of this necessity is that the prophet is superior to the philosopher, and this superiority is clearly stated by Avicenna. This clear assertion of the superiority of the prophet over the philosopher is remarkable for a thinker like Avicenna, for whom the theoretical intellect is the noblest power of man, for whom human life reaches its full realization only when it is devoted to the perfection of the same intellect, and for whom true felicity in the hereafter depends on the realization of this intellect. In my book, I managed to give full meaning to the affirmation of this preeminence. Its doctrinal consequences are important. It provides a foundation for Avicenna's ethical and political theory. Moreover, it is the whole of Avicenna's cosmology that it invites us to reinterpret. Indeed, the prophetic function could also be characterized as cosmological insofar as, like the agent intellect, the prophet diffuses intelligible light in the sensible world. One must keep in mind here the exegesis that Avicenna proposes on the verse of light 24:35, in which he compares the prophet intellect to the holy oil, which is almost illuminated without even a fire touching it. This is not an allegorical exegesis. The prophet is the human being whose intellect is most similar to the separate intellects. He manifests in the sensible world something of the brightness and the intelligible light. He transmits to his fellow human beings what he received from the heavenly world. Whether on the noetic level or on the ethical and poetical level, the prophet's function is to call human beings back to their true nature, to enjoin them to convert to their principles. The prophet manifests the possibility granted to human beings of beginning a movement of conversion toward the suprasensible world. Therefore, the exemplarity of the prophet does not mean that for Avicenna any man can become a prophet. It carries with it a genuine metaphysical function. The prophet plays an important part in the procession which starts from the first principle, extend to the divisibility of the material world. He is in a sense the actual point of the process of emanation and conversion. His very existence manifests the maximum degree of perfection with which a human being can be endowed. In terms of its noetic capacity, the intellect of the prophet is compared to the whole of the Quranic verse, which ignites without even being touched by fire. His intellect manifests the higher degree of realization that a human intellect can reach. This climax at the noetic level has a metaphysical significance. At the level of the sublunary world, the presence of pure matter, closer to non-being, exalts the flow coming directly from the agent intellect, whose ultimate source is God, the first principle of all that is. However, the sensible world is not the world of darkness, devoid of any divine spark. It contains the human soul, a spiritual and noble substance that is similar to the separate substance of the celestial world. Through the intellect, the soul converts itself to the principle of its being, the agent intellect. This sanction is a source of perfection for the sensible world. Among all human souls, one of them, even if it's not the only one, that of the prophet is endowed with a singular and essential function. We know that for an ordinary being, the intellect is in its first disposition is a material intellect, devoid of any intelligible form. It is like pure matter, a mere potentiality. To be in actuality, it needs to be in conjunction with the agent intellect. As long as the soul is attached to the body, its power of intellection cannot be fully in actuality. Even when this power reaches the degree of acquired intellect, it is still dependent on the agent intellect, since acquired intellect does not designate an ultimate stage of the human intellect itself, but rather a stage at which the human intellect enjoys a close and singular relationship with the transcendent active intellect. In order to exercise its own activity, the human intellect is thus subordinated to this transcendental principle. The agent intellect is compared to the fire that communicates its heat. The heat belongs to it by essence, but it is only participated by what receives it, means human souls. For Avicenna, the knowledge of the rational soul is in its link with the separate intellect cannot be called noetic in the real sense of the term, because there is no unity of the knowing and the known. Avicenna's doctrine of intellective knowledge is characterized by its extrinsicism. There is then a radical epistemic and ontological break between the mode of knowledge of the separate intellects, for which the subject of intellection and the object of intellection are one and the same thing, and the intellect of man, for which this is not the case. More than the link to corporeality, it is in this rupture that the specific mode of knowledge of the rational soul consists. Avicenna confers on the relation between the soul and the body a positive and determining value in the process of knowledge. The relation to corporality determines the mode of knowledge proper to human being insofar as he is precisely a being subject to the intermittence of the junction with the agent intellect. His intellective thought unfolds in time. The human being is a being in a process of becoming, who progressively acquires the perfection that is proper to him until he attains, after the separation from the body, an intellectual beatitude. It is not given to man here below to grasp the whole of intelligible reality at once. From a noetic perspective, there is what we can call a vulnerability of the human being. His intellect is dependent on a transcendent principle. The human intellect remains, as long as the subject is here on earth, subject to the intermittence of this junction with the agent intellect. Like everything that is in potency, the human intellect needs to be actualized by an entity in actuality. However, there is no guarantee that such actualization would take place. From a metaphysical point of view, this uncertainty is unacceptable. It is necessary that at least one human being be assured of this connection, and that he then transmit to his fellow man the knowledge of the principle. Such a human being is the prophet. In a passage of the Treatise on the Soul of the Shifa, Avicenna explains, and it's text 5, sometimes the middle term of a syllogism is acquired through knowing, even though the first principle of learning are always obtained through intuition, since all knowledge can ultimately be reduced to certain principles that were discovered by the masters, arbab, who then transmits them to the disciples. The prophet is one of these arbab, in that his intellect is quasi in actuality without even receiving illumination from the agent intellect, just as the old referred to it in the Quranic verse, is quasi-illuminated without even the fire touching it. Thus, from the noetic point of view, the prophet is given an indispensable meditation function. In Uyun al-Hikmah, Avicenna clearly states that prophets are among arbab. This is text 6. The principle of this division, which are known as those of theoretical science, are acquired through the masters, arbab, of the divine religion, al-millah al-ilahiyya, following the path of indication, ala sabil al-tanbih. This is not saying that all theoretical knowledge comes from the prophet, for this would be a betrayal of Avicenna's thought, which considers that the philosopher can, thanks to the junction of his intellect with the agent intellect, grasp the reality of the intellectual world. It is rather a question here of basing, from a metaphysical point of view, the emanation of theoretical knowledge on at least one intellect, that of the prophet, whose existence is necessitated by divine providence. This means that even if no philosopher at a given time is able to receive theoretical knowledge through the mediation of his theoretical intellect, humanity would not be deprived of it. This question is the subject of a debate between Abu Bakr al-Razi and Abu Hatim al-Razi in the I'lam al-Nubuwa, the former believing that men of science and philosophers can dispense with prophecy to establish their knowledge, while the latter considers that all knowledge ultimately goes back to that of the prophet, who then transmits it to men. Avicenna, one could say, adopts a middle position. Philosophers do not need the prophet to attain theoretical knowledge, But from a metaphysical point of view, it is necessary to establish the existence of a human being, the prophet, who receives without preparation or learning the intelligible according to an order, including the middle term. It is through the human intellect that the divine light spreads in the sensible world, illuminates it, and in a sense divinizes it. The human intellect is the most suitable place to receive this light and diffract it, just as the Mishka mentioned in the Quranic verse is the most suitable receptacle to receive the divine light. However, among all intellects, that of the prophet has a singular receptivity to this light, such that it seems to illuminate itself like the holy all. This noetic of light is to be taken very seriously. It establishes the existence of a mediating intellect, that of the prophet, which ensures the presence among human beings of a man whose intellect is almost intellectualized. This noetic of light is part of a metaphysic of lights, which form the possibility of conversion of human beings toward a principle. The lights proceeds from the first principles and descend to the sensible worlds by the mediation of the celestial entities. The intellect of the prophet manifests the possibility of full receptivity to this celestial light in the sublunary world, and also manifests the ultimate movement of conversion of the human creature toward the celestial world. Indeed, Avicenna characterizes the holy intellect, which is specific to the prophet, as the highest state of realization that a human being can reach, in this text 7. This is a kind of prophecy, or rather its highest form, the one most deserving of being called holy power, Quwa Qudsiyya. It is the highest degree of human powers. However, the prophet does not exercise his function of mediation between the sensible world and the celestial world solely by means of his intellect. His imagination is fully receptive to the heavenly world and exercises also an important mediation function, which I propose to analyze now. The prophet is the human being whose imagination has a singular relationship with the unseen world, Alam al-Ghaib, so that what happens to an ordinary human being during sleep happens to the prophet in the waking states. On the issue of dream, Avicenna states that genuine vision of the heavenly world, of the Malakut, sometimes happen during sleep. These visions are often furtive, and one's imagination must transliterate them with its own symbols in order to apprehend them. These symbols will be chosen according to the dreamer's own personality, his culture, the time in which he lives, his psychic and physical state at the time of his dream. Thus, the imagination sometimes faithfully reproduces what the celestial world has given it to witness, but it generally tends to imitate the vision because it is not able to determine it with precision. Avicenna adds that the process that explains prophetic vision is the same as that which explains true dreams. The difference is that in the case of a prophetic vision, the prophet's imagination is more often faithful to the original vision. However, if dream, he tells us, requires interpretation, and divine inspiration requires exegesis, its ta'bir and ta'wil, it is precisely because the imagination imitates the heavenly world with variable precision, depending on the activity of the other powers of the soul. Imitation here has the sense of a configuration by the prophet's imagination of something that has been grasped from the imaginal world of the heavenly souls. The prophet, thanks to the receptivity of his imagination, is able, sometimes but not always, to faithfully reproduce the visions. Because of the inability of the imagination to determine the visions, the interpretation of dreams on the one hand and the exegesis of revelation on the other have the same function as that of memory, says Avicenna. And he explained that in the Treatise of the Soul of the Kitab al-Shifa. It's the long text that you have it's number 8, which is really interesting. We can read just the end. What there would not be firmly retained in the memory, what has been shown of the heavenly kingdom, only what is an imitation of it is firmly retained. Thus, the image of the Malakut, says Avicenna, constitutes for the soul a principle or a beginning. But then the imagination, even that of the prophet, takes hold of the soul and distracts it from the original vision. It moves from one image to another and prevents the soul from fixating its vision. The result is that for ordinary people, only a small part of the dreams will be meaningful, while other dreams will be only confused dreams, what he called adrat al-ahlam. The imagination imitates configures vision of the heavenly world and then project them into the common sense so that they can be apprehended with the same vividness as if they were seen from the outside. Imagination does not faithfully reproduce this vision. It produces an imitation of them. Mimesis here is characteristic of the activity of the imagination. Imagination does not faithfully reflect the image of the Malakut. Indeed, we have seen that if divine inspiration, what Avicenna called wahi, needs exegesis, ta'wil, and if dreams need interpretation, ta'bir, it is because the power of imagination is rarely faithful to what it has witnessed of the heavenly world. Imagination imitates, that is, creates a new psychic content. The prophet is the human being whose imagination has a singular relationship with the unseen world, alam al-ghaib. So that's what happened to the ordinary sleeper during his sleep happens to the prophet in the waking state. Moreover, the prophetic imagination is more faithful than that of the most other human beings. However, it is not fully faithful and operates like that of other human beings, although to a lesser extent, producing imitation of what has been given to him to witness from the heavenly world. For this reason, what is transmitted by wahi, by divine inspiration, needs to be subjected to exegetical work. It appears then that the Avicennian doctrine of imagination has a determining consequence on the status of the revelation. What the prophet transmits to his congener is not always the reality of the invisible world, but sometimes constitute a mimesis of this word coined by his imagination. It means that Avicenna gives us a metaphysical foundation of the necessity of the Quranic ta'wil, which is really important. Let us now examine the third modality of prophecy, the ability of the prophet's soul to act on matter, not only on the matter of his own body, but on the matter of bodies in general. In Book 4 of the Treatise of the Soul of the Shifa, devoted to the internal senses, Avicenna dedicates the fourth and final chapter to the study of the motive power and one of the modes of prophecy that depends on this power. It calls it al-quwa al-nafsaniya al-amaliya. It is about the ability of the prophet's soul to act on matter and thereby perform what can be seen as miracle. It is also in this chapter that Avicenna establishes that psychic conception can have an influence on bodies. It seems that the extension of this doctrine to prophetology, namely the capacity of the prophet's soul to influence bodies and matter in general, is the correspondence at the level of the sensible world of a fundamental principle of the celestial world. At the level of the relationship to matter and corporeality, the prophet does also appear as a mediator. His soul, like the soul of the celestial sphere, has the power to shape matter according to his own conception, tasawwurat. Thanks to the presence of the prophet's soul, the sensible world in its corporality maintains a relationship similar to that of the soul of the celestial spheres with the body of the spheres and the sensible matter in general. As an effect of divine providence, the prophet is a necessary mediator between God, the heavenly world, and the sensible world. He is like an axis around which the link between the celestial world and the sensible world is articulated. Without the presence of the prophet, the perfect order that reigns in the celestial world could not be reproduced here in the sensible world. The link that unites separate intellects and celestial souls and celestial bodies is embodied in the person of the prophet. He is not only the paradigm of the man who fully realizes his potentialities, but a necessary presence in the sensible world, which he links to the intelligible and celestial world. The three prophetic perfections we have mentioned, that of the intellect, that of the imagination, and that of the body, correspond to the three levels of emanation, that of intellects, that of souls, and that of bodies. By actualizing this triple perfection in the sensible world, the prophet manifests the possibility of extending here below the perfection that reigns in the celestial world. He thus embodies a perfection that each human being could realize by becoming fully receptive to the celestial gifts in its three dimensions: noetic, imaginal, and corporal. The sensible world, the world of human being, is not cut off from the celestial world, but derives from it and remains in being because it is linked to its source. Only forgetfulness and the repeated assault of the animal and concupiscible powers makes a human being believe that he is in exile, abandoned by the divine providence. The perfection of the prophetic powers acts as a reminder of this fundamental metaphysical truth. It opened to human beings the way to the perfection of their own noetic, psychic, and bodily powers, on the condition that they remember their celestial origin and turn to it. Nevertheless, if the prophet is a model, his exemplarity is founded in the very structure of Avicenna's metaphysical system. The advent of a prophet in the world is not a fortuitous event brought about because a human being has incidentally succeeded in perfecting his psychic powers. This event is a divine decision, the realization of which depends on a complex causal chain, or, if one wishes to express it in theological terms, which Avicenna does, it is a decision pertaining to the divine qadar and being realized only through the qadar. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was fascinating. It was within the sphere of Avicenna studies. It was a wonderful counter to the kind of Guttassian deracination of Avicennism from religion. He's a profound religious thinker, that's clear. And on that, I really wanted to hear more from you about this role of the compositive imagination, since he clearly says that it has a fundamental role in prophetic discourse, i.e. the Quran. And so how does he divide it up? I read in some Avicenna texts that the particular truths, juz'i truths, are transmitted to a prophet by celestial souls, and universal or kulli truths from celestial intellects, or cherubim, and sometimes called kerubim. But what constitutes the particular aspect of scripture, of Holy Scripture, for him? Not just eschatology, or primarily eschatology.
There is only one scholar who noticed. I I discovered at the end of my work. It was Fazlur Rahman who said that there is a double origin for the revelation. One is from the active intellect, and the other one is from the celestial sources. So in the Risala al-Adhawiyya fi Amr al-Ma'ad, Avicenna explains that the Quran should be read in two different ways. One is accepting what is said without interpretation. He said some verses of the Quran are giving us the real tawheed. For example, he makes a ta'wil of Surah Al-Ikhlas, and he treats it as a noetic treatise. He shows that all his conception of necessary existence, possible existence, is in the Surah Al-Ikhlas. It is not that he's showing a correspondence, a mere correspondence, saying, oh, look, philosophers find this. No, it's really that he considers Surah Al-Ikhlas as a noetic text, as carrying the same strength than a philosophical text. But also he says in the same Risala al-Adhawiyya fi Amr al-Ma'ad that some other verses of the Quran should be submitted to ta'wil. Those are those given to the Prophet by his imagination. Because the imagination of the Prophet, as I tried to explain, is the imagination is always working by composing things and imitating things. It's never faithful. The imagination, it's the way of, it works like that. So when the Prophet's imagination catches something, witness something from Alam al-Ghayb, even if it's the Prophet, his imagination is going to imitate. So this is what happens to us when we sleep. This is why he says in a beautiful text in Danishname Ilahi that when I dream something, when I wake up, I have to say, what have I seen that it was finally a tree? I have to, he said, it's very modern to go from one image to another because I am, for example, living in France, so in a cold country, so warm would be something good for me. So it won't be the same for you or the same for someone who lives in India. So each one with his habit, his personality, which will go. And so he say a part of the revelation, the one who come through the imagination of the Prophet, should be submitted to ta'wil, which is extraordinary. He doesn't say that something in the Quran is not a God coming from the celestiality, or the Prophet did adapt his discourse to al-Hamma, to the common people. No, he says, because the source is coming from the celestial spheres, and because it comes to the imagination, because it cannot come to the intellect cannot receive something which is not universal, is very strict on this distinction. So it comes to the imagination, and because the imagination is always doing this imitating work, even with this we have to. So this is say the reading the Quranic text needs ta'wil, the same that the dreams need ta'bir, which is extraordinary when we think about it. So he gives a foundation, a metaphysical foundational to the exegesis, to the Quranic exegesis, which is, I mean, nowadays we really need that.
So Surah Al-Ikhlas doesn't require ta'wil.
No.
But how many sort of theological references in the Quran are affected by al-Fayad?
He doesn't say. And he's not very, I mean, he's very expeditive when it's only, the only text I found talking about that is Risala al-Adhawiyya Amr al-Ma'ad, and he's just saying some needs ta'wil, some others shouldn't be. And he said, for example, the Torah is all needs ta'wil. So does it mean that Moïse received the Torah only by his imagination? I don't know, he doesn't say. But it's really interesting. But he doesn't give, I mean, yeah, he gives some example that I analyze in my book of some verses that, for example, I don't know them by heart, I'm sorry. But he gives some example from some verses that should need to be interpreted and others that should not be interpreted. And, but it's only, I mean, he doesn't write a treatise about that. It's some lines in the how we have to underline.
So does he refer to Quran 3:7 in this regard, the difference between ayat muhkamat and ayat mutashabbihat?
Not at all, never. He really integrates. I mean, when people ask me, is he a theologian? I said, no, it's a philosopher who integrates theological question and insert them in his philosophical system. He's very systematic. So everything that happens in his world, he's a Muslim man of the 10th century, 10th, 11th century, so he integrates everything in his philosophical system. For example, the ziyarat. He treats up about ziyarat, why fasting is good, why going to everything. He thinks it as a philosopher, in my view. But yeah, it's. I mean, when we see what he writes about prophecy, I don't see how we can put him out of the Islamic paradigm.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I have a lot of questions, but I'll try to limit myself. But since we're at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, I think one question that I need to ask is whether the Ismaili prophetology has had any influence on Avicenna's, since as is well known, Avicenna's father and brother were both Ismailis, or so he says. And we know that before Avicenna, Al-Sijistani, for instance, had a very elaborated prophetology. So, I mean, I know that this is not exactly your field of research, but what is your take on this matter?
As I told you when we were before, I was really surprised when I finished my work to the result. To be honest, I had never thought that Avicenna was so. I wouldn't say Muslim, but yeah, was so concerned with all these questions, and he says, and everyone knows that he was not himself an Ismaili. But when we see this mediating metaphysical function that I saw, if I'm not wrong, yeah, we cannot do not think about this mediating role of the Imam in the Ismaili thought. So, but he arrived that with his own way, taking his own principles. So in this way, I don't know if we could say that he's really influenced, that he took something, but he really built something with his own system, with his own epistemology, noetics, etc. And for example, I said, but it was very quick, that the prophet is necessary to the political and ethical life. This is because Avicenna thinks that the moral laws cannot be found by intellectual apprehension, because they are positive law, they are not eternal. So in this way, he's very Ash'arite. And then, so it cannot be the philosopher who got them. So it has to be, and we cannot let men without them, because they will kill each other. Everyone, he says, everyone will believe that what belongs to him is better than, so they will kill each other. So God could not have let them. So he sent them the prophet with law, with the Sharia. So this is very, in a way, is very close to the Ash'arite conception of ethical and political ethical laws. So he really built his system and arrived at something which is in a way as close to the Ismaili, but I don't know.
But that is on the political and ethical level. But what about the noetic level? I mean, what about the proximity of his noetics, the prophetic noetics, in his thought and in I don't know, Sijistani, for instance, this whole notion of the ta'yid, the divine assistance that the prophet benefits from. The word doesn't appear in Avicenna.
Yes.
It does.
It appears exactly in one text. He said, this is not possible except for a man who's benefiting from the ta'yid. So we know that's the prophet. I don't remember where it is, but he says that exactly. But the difference that, for example, for him, the philosopher does not need the prophet to attain the intellect, the universal knowledge. So this is a difference, because for the Ismaili, the prophet is the one who is perfecting the intellect of his fellow man. So this is different. So it's difficult I couldn't answer clearly because it wouldn't be honest.
Thank you. Just one more question, and I'll give the floor to the public. So I noticed that your book includes an index of Quranic verses, which, in my opinion, should be the case in all books related to all books of Islamic studies, but which is in fact relatively unusual, especially in publications related to Arabic and Islamic philosophy. So what prompted you to include such an index in your book, and given the role of the Prophet, as you highlighted it in Avicenna's thought, how would you evaluate the importance of the Quran in his works?
To make this book, I translated, because there is no French translation of the Shifa, of the Kitab al-Shifa. So I translated the last book of the Kitab al-Shifa, which is the 10th book. It's not very big, and it's the India annex. And while I was working very closely, I said, this is Quranic, this is Quranic, this is Quranic, and all the vocabulary is Quranic in this. It's incredible. And then I said, no, I have to put all the references. So it was obvious that I had to make an index with the Quranic references. So it's really surprising. And even me, I work on Avicenna since like 25 years. I would have never imagined that his Shifa, especially the Shifa, because when he writes the prologue of the Shifa, he says, this is a book made in the peripatetic method, and it will be the new synthesis, replacing that of Aristotle, which happens really. But it's not the Isharat. It's not a text, it's not the Adhawiyya fi Amr al-Ma'ad, it's not a text where he is going through a religious question. It's really the Shifa, which is his most repetition work. And when you read the 10th book, every 2 words you have, every 2 lines you have 2, 3, 4 Quranic words, concepts. The law, the Quranic law is, you found the aslah, the notion of aslah. All his providence is built on the notion of aslah, which is very important.
Can you explain for our audience?
In the Mu'tazili theology, it's the idea that God has to create the best for the human in his creation. This is the aslah. So all Avicenna's theory of providence is built on this notion. And if you work on Avicenna ignoring this part of Islamic theology, you don't see it. And you say, oh, this is philosophical. No, it's a very important Islamic theological conception. So he says that the angels will have images of different words and will choose the aslah, the best one. So in a way, it's very Leibnizian.
Yes,
because the creation of the world is not a necessary and mechanical creation. You know, it has been said about Avicenna that the creation is in a way mechanical and everything is necessary. He said, no. I mean, I was very surprised to this is also in the 10th book, which no one really studied because it's really bizarre and the first chapter is really difficult because it's all on this causality and providence and this question of the aslah. So the angels plays a very important role. And you know that for the Arabic philologists, Malak and Rasul, Malak comes the root is Aluka, which is giving a message. And in the Quran, I have noted that somewhere. Yeah. Rasul is associated to Malek in Quran 1795, and Rasul designates Gabriel in 1919, 20, 96, 69, 40, etc. So this role of mediation of the angel and the prophet is very Quranic also, and he philosophically completely rebuilt it and took it. So he's nourished and by the Quranic, how to say, doxa, vision du monde.
Worldview.
Yeah.
All right, so I think this concludes our session. Thank you very much, Meryem, for this great talk. Thank you for the audience for coming in, and for the team of the AKC for helping us setting this event. And hopefully see you at the next lecture. Thank you.